All right, 2 o'clock. Should we get started? All right, well, thank you so much for coming to my talk today. This is the first time I've got up here in a number of years, so I appreciate you taking the time. So today we're going to talk about the different navigating between what users want and what they need. But, first is the obligatory, here I am, here's me. Actually, it passed that. Okay, well, apparently technology doesn't want you to know who I am, but I'm Brittany. I work for a company called Teamshares. I'm in work in product there. I've been deep in fintech for a number of years, at times whether I wanted to or not, quite frankly. But I found this niche for myself of building digital banks. So I'm building a digital bank for Teamshares. I've built digital banks for mission-focused companies over the last couple of years. But we're not necessarily here just to talk about me. We're here to talk about our customers. So, and more specifically, what users want and versus what they need. So here's kind of the overarching thing that I'm going to talk about today. I will be using public fintech examples that most people should be aware of. If you're not, don't worry, I'll kind of go through them. But I think it should hopefully be fun to work through these things you might be familiar with. I'm hoping it will feel a little bit more like a conversation instead of me just yabbing at you for like 40 minutes, but either way, let's kind of jump in. So if there's anything for you to take away from this, I would love for you to understand that it's more than just the words that are said by customers, by stakeholders, by, quite frankly, anyone. And I would argue that it's more than just like having empathy for our customers. It goes really beyond that. I believe there is a ton of hidden context that we're ignoring, and that is kind of the core of this disconnect between what customers articulate as their wants and what customers might actually need. And so we kind of know from our day-to-day interactions that communication in everyday life is more than the words that come out of our mouth, right? It's all the things that we're doing with our body, with our tone, the relationship, context of the people that are having this conversation. But all of that doesn't just go away because we're building a digital product. And I'll explain more. And I wouldn't be a good PM if I didn't kind of start with, like, what's the problem that we're solving? And this presentation is no different. So if we know that there's this disconnect, is that the problem that we're solving for? Well, I'm going to start with some things that I do know. I know specifically that words mean different things to different people. For example, the word strategy. You all probably have an idea what that means in your head. Maybe some of you have the same idea, probably not. For example, actually the last place that I worked, my old boss asked me as the VP of product to create a strategy. And what he actually meant, and I found out over many, many weeks, was that he meant KPIs and hard numbers to build to. But my definition of a strategy and how I understood it is a bit more of like a targeted version or vision of something, whether it's a company vision, a product line, or things of that nature, but it's very clear about what's in that strategy and what are the things that we're not going to do. So this rub between like what he expected to come out of that versus what I expected to come out of that really caused, let's say, some conflict. It's a nice way to put it. Something else that I know. What someone says is often different from what they mean. And I don't make it to seem like this is intentional or that someone's being disingenuous. Like, think about the last time that you said something that you didn't quite mean. And not in the, yes, founder, that's a great idea and I'll build it overnight and it's everything. But more in the like, oh, I didn't quite mean it in that way. Like, let me rephrase that. So I kind of boil this down to it's just humans working with other humans. And because we know this, and we feel maybe that we've taken all this to account as we're building products, what if I told you that 40 to 95% of products don't meet customer needs? Was this stat kind of surprising to some of y'all? No, not at all. I know. Agreed. I felt the same way, right? Like, even though this stat comes from Harvard Business Review study, and the range is wide, because I think a lot of companies aren't necessarily forthright about the mistakes that they made. But nevertheless, I felt this, but seeing the numbers were like, yeah, okay. But for as many smart people that it takes to build and launch products, having this number kind of leads me to believe that there's a breakdown somewhere along this path. And I'm suggesting that the breakdown is a little bit meta. So I see that the breakdown, and a major reason for that stat, is that we're solving a problem, but not necessarily the right problem. So we're going to walk through a few examples. We'll keep coming back through to this conversation to kind of take the theory and bring it to the practice and showcase the difference between a problem to solve and maybe better problems to solve. And I would argue that it requires us to slow down, which is probably a controversial thing coming from a product manager, but nevertheless, here we go. So let's start with our first example. Okay, so disclaimer, the Spot Me feature, I did not build it. I did not work on it, and I'm not calling out any specific fintech that may have a similar feature. But for those unfamiliar, a Spot Me-like feature is from a B2C digital bank. It's usually like a short-term loan up to a cap of like a couple $100, maybe $100 tops, given to an end user. And so on the surface, the problem is, from a user's perspective, I need money until I get paid. And that is, this money could pay for things like gas, food, a bus pass, medicine, what have you. It's a reasonable need, and this Spot Me feature is a reasonable solve for that need. But when I think about it and I break it down a little bit more, I realize it's not as simple as that. Giving the short-term advance actually creates this negative cycle in most cases, right? Where people kind of always need that extra Spot Me to make it to the next paycheck, and it creates this anxious feeling. And knowing that these are the outcomes for your user, does it still feel like the right problem to solve if it makes things worse for them at the end? This may be what they want, but is it really what they need? So let your mind twirl on that. I also wanted to bring in a B2B example. So instant payments, for those unfamiliar, is kind of like an advance, but not quite an advance, but for small businesses. So let's say, also, disclaimer, I did not build this. If this matches your company, that was totally unintentional. Let's say there's a payment processor out there that offers businesses their money that they've accrued, their revenue, sooner before a fee. And again, a reasonable request by a customer, small business is hard. Sometimes ACH timelines can mean that someone, you can't make payroll, right? For whatever reason, someone in your team isn't getting paid. Or it means that you can't buy the necessary inventory to make the things to make some more money. So again, completely reasonable. But when you break it down a bit more, again, there's a little bit more under the surface. Fast money is not cheap. And so think about any check cashing service or loan sharks out there where you bring them your check and they take essentially 50% of it. And then as we've seen with venture lately, like profitability matters for a business. So again, like knowing that this potential solution causes profitability challenges for your customer, does it still feel like we're solving the right problem here? Again, this might be what they want, and in the short-sightedness, they might be fine with the trade-off, but is it what they need is really the core. So how did we find ourselves here? Again, thinking about that stat, let's say it's on the lower end that 40% of products don't meet customer needs. How did we get here? So it could be any of these things, right? Maybe we just too easily took our customer requests at face value. Maybe our users don't actually know what they want or they can't articulate what they need. I definitely know that there's cultural and systemic issues that lead a person to believe a certain thing or perceive a need in a certain way if they don't realize all the opportunities ahead of them. Maybe it's all of these things. Maybe it's a list of a dozen other things. I don't know. But again, we're just humans working with other humans. But if we want to change that stat around, maybe we need to do things differently. And what can we do differently? I'm glad you asked. Thank you. So slow down and deconstruct what is said versus what is meant. And disclaimer, this does not mean or give permission to play into some type of like savior complex, as if that we know better as product or as a fintech. We like sit in this ivory tower and we know better. I see that a lot with the network companies that my company buys. This is just acknowledging that humans are complicated and complex creatures, and you rarely get the whole answer on the first try. So there's a ton of important context that tends to be left out of conversations. And so I want to share ways that you can bring that context back into the conversation. So we're going to go through 4 different methods that you could potentially use in different ways. And we're going to start with the 5 whys. Has anyone heard of the 5 whys before? Okay. All right, got 2 hands up. All right. So I figured about 20% of the room would, which is maybe a little less, but okay, all right. How about continuous user research? Yeah, okay, some more of those, okay, I love that. I figured about 50% of us did. How about motives to be met? Okay, all right, we got the all-star over here, all right, cool beans. I thought about 5%. And what about 5 steps forward? Okay, that was a trick question because I made that up, so good. So we'll go through each of these examples, or each of these methods using the examples we talked about earlier. And I want to call out that these can actually each build on each other. So you'll see, hopefully through the examples, that some are focusing on finding the right problem, some are focused on really understanding your customer, and some are focused on the actual solution. You may not use each method every time, and as they say, or as someone says, if you want better answers, or in our case, better products, I think you need to ask better questions. So let's revisit one of the first examples with our first method, the 5 whys. So for the 5 whys, it's essentially just a request where you start to ask why once at a time repeatedly. And the goal is to get to like the underlying problem. So using that Spot Me example where someone is like, hey, I need some money until I get paid, the first why could reveal, well, why do you need that? It's like, well, because I have something to pay for and I just don't have the money. Ask why again. Well, okay, because I spent the money on some treats and now I can't pay rent. And then you kind of rinse and repeat, as you can see. And with each subsequent why, you're finding out a different problem and addressing any assumptions that you may have. The problem that you started with can look very different from the problem that you ended with. Again, once all this kind of hidden context is serviced. And then you can decide, is this a problem we're solving? And is this a problem that you should be solving? Because they're not always the same, right? So using these 5 whys can really help you identify the right problem. And as you can see here, like the answer to number 2 could be very, very different. It could be not because I spent money on treats, but because my car broke down and I had to get to work that day. Or my kid was sick and I needed to buy medicine. It could be so many different things. And getting to like the underlying problem is really key. Moving on to the second method, continuous user research. So a lot more of you have heard about this, so I won't like belabor this. But I kind of think about continuously understanding or growing the understanding of your persona to the point where you make it really real. So it's not just 4 attributes of like Black, urban, educated women in this age range. It takes it way, way beyond that. So using that Spot Me example again, you could kind of see how like a lightweight persona of, urban Uber driver, and then that problem of needing money till a payday might lead you in one direction. But through this continuous user research, you might have now a thorough or better defined persona where it's actually, you get a better idea of who you're working with. This person is actually working minimum wage, but they're in school currently. They have impulse control issues. And this can help you lead to a different direction. So overall, the importance here is understanding that like you're not going to be able to truly understand your users and how best to support them if you're talking to them once or twice a year, because there's so much context that you're not going to be able to gather in that time frame. The motives to be met, on the other hand, is a little bit of a twist on the jobs to be done framework, if anyone's familiar there. So knowing what problems people have is step 1, but that's not enough. And Laura talks about how the fact that you need to know who to listen to, why those problems matter to them, how much they matter, and what factors might influence their feelings. Because knowing what the problems are, it's not enough. So now switching to the instant payments example, the problem is I need access to my revenue as soon as possible. And the potential motives could be, well, I need the cash because I need to pay my team, I need to meet payroll. Or it could be, I'm anxious about anything that could happen under the sun, and I want that money to feel prepared just so I can go about my day. And as you can see, these are two very different motives behind the same problem statement. The why matters a lot here in truly defining the right problem. It's similar in ways to the 5 whys, but again, kind of different. And the motives to be met explain why the problem is a problem for that person. And the 5 steps forward, the one that I kind of coined myself, I guess. And I use this in my day-to-day, not just for product development, actually, a lot of team management issues as well. So imagine the next kind of 5 steps if you were to move forward with this proposed solution. Does it actually solve the problem when you take it 5 steps out? And does it match the type of support that you want to provide for the user? So in the instant payouts example, if the goal was to support small businesses, you take that potential solution that seems like a solve for the problem and then kind of take it 5 steps forward. And as you see here, this is a bit of an exaggerated version for effect, where a proposed solution would be charge users to get access to their revenue sooner. The 5 steps forward would be companies get less revenue, they enter this negative cycle, it reduces the need to understand their cost drivers, and the business is worse off. But I think it helps illustrate that things aren't as nice and clean as they seem. When you come up with a solution, this is going to be it. This is going to solve the problem. I moved on. It's not as simple as that. And I did want to call out the fact that some businesses don't care, quite frankly. They're there for the trade-off. And I get it. They want to make a profit. You're not running a charity. But then it becomes your choice if you want to work for that type of company or not. So I'll just leave that there. So in practice, and kind of to summarize the actual steps, the 5 whys, it's pretty straightforward. Why repeatedly. For continuous research, though, if you have a big customer base, if you happen to work for a bigger company, you meet with people every week or as often as you're able to. Use incentives as needed. Some people are actually really happy to talk to you on a consistent basis. Some people are not, so you kind of test that out. And I do want to caveat that this is not a simple thing, continuous user research. It takes a lot of effort, people to conduct the interviews, people to source participants, get the notes, all of those. It's not an easy thing, but I truly believe it is worth it. If you don't have a big user base, you're a startup, you're just launching, you're a seed, Series A, you can lean on a lot of tools. There's lots of tools out there that can do the recruitment part of things. Respondent.io is the one that I use myself, but now they've become expensive, so find a new one. There's tools out there to help conduct some interviews unmoderated with prototypes. There are some tools like Sprig that'll help transcribe and do the notes, all those types of things. So there's lots of opportunities out there when it comes to implementing continuous user research. The motives to be met, I would say start with a really defined persona, so likely an outcome of that initial continuous research, and then start to dig a little bit deeper. Once you have this defined persona, why do we care about it? Being really clear and how that aligns with how you and where you want to go as a business and a product. But it will require you to, as you kind of dig into additional conversations with this persona, your questions matter so much more here. They will directly impact the quality of your responses. Because remember, you're going to be like a detective, really trying to figure out more than just the what. You're really trying to figure out the why. So be willing to kind of go deep and not necessarily wide, and have some really good targeted follow-up questions, such as, well, tell me more about that, or why is that important to you? How does that make you feel, and like how would you want to feel? Again, uncovering a lot more than just the things that someone says. 5 steps forward. All right, so for this one, you can, again, this is more solution focused, whereas some of the other ones we went through are customer and problem focused. For this one, after you have potentially used some of those other frameworks or methods, kind of cosplay as a user and like press fast forward. So I have these like 5 steps of how I kind of do it in my day-to-day. Remind myself of the goal, establish a logic tree of options, assess and highlight the most and probably second most likely path forward, and then confirm once you get to the end of that tree, like, does this achieve the goal? Does it achieve it in the way that we expect? And does it help my customer at the end of the day? Because as a PM, that's the entire purpose, I think, is for me to advocate for my customer inside this business. And because I'm a dork, like, reach is the thing. You can hopefully see the mnemonic to help you remember, but I'm fast forwarding through this entire presentation, so it's not going to take 40 minutes. But nevertheless, here we go. So if we were to revisit these examples, on the surface, where we started in the presentation, the problem to be solved for the Spot Me feature was, I need some money until I get paid. Maybe the new problem to be solved is a little bit different. And as you can see here, maybe it's something around like, well, help me save my money for some of the most important things in my life first. And this could look very different from what ended up being the Spot Me feature. This could be soft reminders when the user is spending at non-essential places. It could be understanding what those most important things are in their life, when those items are due, and moving that area or that money to like a safe area so it's always protected. It could be providing discounts for their consistent expenses, i.e. lowering their expenses so they can have more free cash. Like, it could look like a bunch of different things that is not exactly the Spot Me feature, but aligns more to things that help them, the things that they need out of this versus the things that they just want. Yeah, and if you can, like, any of these things can help and potentially help the customer quality of life get better, as well as creating brand loyalty. And then for our last example, the instant payouts, very similarly. We started with this problem on the surface. I need access to my revenue as soon as possible. But a potential new problem could be, I need help building a sustainable business by managing my cash flow more efficiently. And similarly, this can end up in different ways. Maybe this looks like helping a business understand which bills to pay, when, and in what order to maximize their cash flow, or any number of options after that. So, in closing, as I said earlier, if you want better answers, I think you just have to ask better questions, because we need to understand more than what the words were said. And in order to build better products or more relevant products to our users, we have to identify better problems to solve. So what does that mean for you? If you're not a user researcher or a product person like I am, it doesn't absolve you of anything. I want to make that clear, right? It means that you have an opportunity during however you're a part of this process, whether that's technical planning, whether it's reviewing cards or product brief, to ask some really great questions to make sure that you're solving the right problem. Product people don't own the monopoly on caring for our customers. I know a lot of my developers love them very much, almost maybe much more than I do at times. And I know you do too. So I bet your PM would love to have those conversations with you. All right. Thank you.